Uh, Welcome to this panel on anti-caste thinkers. My name is Erik Berg. I'm a political scientist in Molde, Norway, where I teach political theory and globalization. I published a book entitled Dynamics of Caste and Law in 2020, and one of my new projects is to continue the work on hegemony in global political thought. And this conference is truly intriguing and fascinating, and I wish to congratulate the organizers for making this possible. And I do identify with the basic ideas and motivation behind the conference, and where one should give space and take seriously the thinkers among the oppressed, and to take common sense or organic thinking seriously. This is an important task for the scientific community for several reasons, and one of them is obviously that scientific explanations and approaches need to be concerned with truth, and we need to learn more about how to address a complex question as caste. As organic thinkers, anti-caste thinkers have thought consistently on the problem of caste and casteism, and may offer penetrating insights into what the problem of oppression is about. And it's a privilege to chair this panel where we have three papers, and I look forward to the presentations. The first speaker is Dr. Mahitosh Mandal, who is assistant professor and head of at the Department of English at Presidency, University Calcutta, and his main areas of interest include Dalit studies, Colonial Bengal, psychoanalysis, and the Holocaust. Dr. Mahitosh Mandal will present a paper with the title Dalit Resistance in Times of Bengal Renaissance: 5 Untouchable Thinkers, Reformers from Colonial Bengal. The second presentation will be first by Vignesh Karthik, who is a doctoral researcher at King's India Institute at the King's College London. And he is the coordinator of Confronting Caste, a seminar and podcast series from King's India Institute. And the second speaker, or the author behind this paper, is Vishal Vasanthakumar, who is a graduate from Harvard Graduate School of Education, and an independent researcher based in Chennai, India, working at the intersection of caste, politics, and education. And the paper has the title "Beyond Anti-Caste Activism: A Periyarist Gaze at Social Justice." Finally, we have the third paper with Prem MR, who has completed an MPhil thesis on Foucauldian ideas of governmentality from University of Hyderabad. He's an assistant professor of sociology at the Crescent School of Law. His interest includes colonial modernity and caste and Dalit mobilization in Tamilnadu. The paper is titled "A Discourse on a Communication Between Ayodhya and Periyar, Possibilities and Transgressing Caste Equations." So I look forward, as I think many in the audience do, to your presentations. We start with Dr. Mahitosh Mandal. You have 15 minutes before we move to the next speaker. And we have Vignesh, Karthik, and Vishal Vasanthakumar before we conclude with Prem Ram's paper. So please keep an eye on the chat function, where you will be informed when you have 3 minutes left. And after the discussion, I'll look forward to the Q&A. So without any further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Mahitosh Mandal. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Erik Berg, and it is really my privilege to be here when you are chairing the session. And I also congratulate my co-panelists. So without much ado, I would begin my paper. The title is, as has been mentioned, Dalit Resistance in Times of Bengal, 5 Untouchable Thinker Reformers from Colonial Bengal. This paper is an attempt to demonstrate the radical age of anti-caste thought in 5 Bengali Dalit thinkers to assert that Dalits were important political agents and knowledge actors in colonial Bengal. Positioned within Dalit historiography, it intends to be a critique of the official nationalist, Marxist, and subaltern historiographies that have been shaping Bengal's intellectual history so far. The paper proposes that such an official history is largely silent about a Dalit renaissance and resistance that had taken place in Bengal during the time the so-called Bengal Renaissance had happened. To demonstrate the range of anti-caste thought and avoid homogenization, it chooses 4 thinkers from 2 numerically large Dalit communities, namely Namashudra and Pondro, and 1 thinker from a numerically small Dalit community, namely Malo. Harichand Thakur, 1812 to 1878, first thinker for analysis, is one of the earliest untouchable thinkers of colonial Bengal. He was born into a Chandal caste, eventually renamed as Namashudra. Harichand's radicalism was expressed in multiple forms. He was critical of Buddhism, Vaishnavism, and Vedantism. For Harichand, Buddhism, admittedly a philosophy that appealed to the masses, degenerated due to its emphasis on ascetic life away from family. Vaishnavism, originating and flourishing in Bengal, had turned the devotees into irresponsible religious beggars of alms and practitioners of unrestrained sexual acts. Harichand observed how a clear caste division emerged among the Vaishnavites themselves. The lower caste and untouchable devotees were hated by their upper caste counterparts. His views were critical of Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, his contemporary, who demanded a sacrifice of desire for women and wealth and replacement of material desire by spiritual bhakti. Harichand dismissed the idea of an abstract and metaphysical Brahman as being of no use for the toiling masses. The point is, Harichand was not influenced by these religious traditions, as Shekhar Bandyopadhyay argues, but radically opposed to mold the distinctness of his political theology. Harichand's religion, known as Mutuaism or religion of the Mutua, was a spiritual discourse structured to address the material requirements of the poor Dalits. His famous dictum, Hate Kaam Mukhe Naam, work with hands, sing God's praise with mouth, was an aphorism against metaphysical, non-materialistic, and abstract theologies. He described his religion as Griha Dharma or family-centric religion. Harichand's life experiences shaped his anti-Brahminical political attitude expressed in the garb of a new religion. His humiliation in the hands of caste Hindus led to boycotting the Brahmin and upper caste landlords in 19th century Bengal. Rather than relying on such landlords, he inspired the Dalits to cultivate abundant lands. While thus focusing on their economic empowerment, he wanted them to rid of superstition by bringing education to them. Furthermore, he dealt a blow at Brahminical patriarchy by promoting equality between men and women, prohibiting polygamy, and speaking of empowerment of women through education and job prospects. Furthermore, Harichand motivated the Dalits to organize and mobilize and participate in politics because political and administrative power was considered crucial for their liberation. He opened the religion of the Mutuas to all Dalits and Muslims, preached interdining, and focused on acquiring political power or Raj Shakti. The religion of the Mutuas was not meant for the Namashudras alone. Mutuaism aimed at evolving into a Bahujan religion. Arguably, it was Guru Chand Thakur, 1846 to 1937, the second thinker, Harichand's son, who extensively applied the philosophy of Mutuaism to the cause of Dalit liberation. Following his father's instruction regarding the importance of education for Dalits, he founded the first ever school for Dalits in 1880, around 30 years after the Phules did so in Maharashtra. By one account, Guru Chand established around 1800 schools in Bengal, out of which 1067 schools were founded in the Dhaka region alone. This pales the educational contribution of Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, the much glorified face of Bengal Renaissance, who established by one account only 36 schools. And yet, it is Vidyasagar who is remembered as the archetypal educational reformer of Bengal, and Guru Chand's revolution in the educational field remains undocumented in the official intellectual history of Bengal. Guru Chand mobilized the peasants as well. He organized them against the exploitative system of the indigo plantation and destroyed the indigo farm of a British Sahib in 1909. He substantially contributed to Bengal's peasant movement from 1910 to 1933. Unlike the upper caste Marxist reformers and historians, he was fully aware that the bulk of the poor peasants were lower castes or outcasts. Therefore, it was as much a struggle to overcome casteism as it was overcoming classism. Perhaps the most defining moment in Guru Chand's movement was his refusal to participate in the nationalist movement launched by the Congress party led by M.K. Gandhi. Gandhi wanted to rope in the Dalits in his anti-British struggle and asked Chittoranjan Das of Bengal to assist him in this regard. However, Guru Chand flatly told Das that their struggles were different. The Dalits needed, first and foremost, emancipation from casteism and poverty, which was caused by the caste Hindus who ironically sought freedom from the British. The Dalits did not have the luxury, according to him, to participate in the Swadeshi movement. For Guru Chand, the so-called freedom struggle was with the freedom of the few, while he was concerned with the freedom of all the oppressed communities. Guru Chand developed a close association with the British and fully utilized the provisions for the lower caste prepared by the British government. Guru Chand was a total movement. Like his father, he was ready to embrace everybody within his fold, all Dalit and lower caste groups from Kumbhakar, Kapali, Mahisho to Chamar, Pundro, Tati, Malakar, and even minority groups like Muslims. When all the theoretical and practical contributions of Harichand and Guru Chand to the Dalits and minorities are considered, one cannot help describing them as agents of social change and reawakening of the lower castes. One critic has rightly described them in Bangla as Banglar অবহেলিত লোকায়ত সমাজের নবজাগরণের যথার্থই দূত, or the harbinger of renaissance for the neglected masses. Harichand and Guru Chand were two Namashudra thinker reformers, the latter carrying forward and concretizing the legacy and philosophy of the former. This can be contrasted with two thinkers, Mahendranath Karan and Rajendra Sarkar, from among the Poundros, another Bengali Dalit community. Mahendranath Karan, 1886 to 1928, was a major figure among a host of Poundro reformers of colonial Bengal. Arguably, he wrote the earliest English language treatise on the history of a Bengali Dalit community titled A History and Ethnology of the Cultivating Pods, 1919, wherein he questioned the derogatory terms like chasha, which means farmer, and pod to denigrate his community, which denigrated his community. Drawing on the Puranic and other Hindu scriptures, he argued why the cultivating pods had actually been Poundro Kshatriyas and should neither be confused with the mixed castes, nor Aryan pods and fishing pods, nor be categorized as depressed class. If Poundros enjoyed the status of the Kshatriyas, how did they lose it and degenerate to the level of the Shudros? The reason given by Karan is similar to the one furnished by Babasaheb Ambedkar in Who Were the Shudros. Karan observes that the Poundros fell from due to living unministered by the Brahmins and thereby the omission of the particular rights of the Kshatriyas. This happened due to the wrath of Parashuram, as per the scriptures, who was on a mission to annihilate the Kshatriyas. Perhaps a major effect on Poundros, according to Karan, was that of Buddhism, to which they converted and which distanced them further from Brahminical rights. However, from the 11th century onwards, the Buddhist converts started embracing Brahminism. According to Karan, during this time, Poundros were condemned as Jal Abhavarjo, or the group of Shudros whose water was not accepted by the Brahmins. Karan ends his text with the suggestion that the only way for the cultivating pods of the Poundros to get back their glory is to perform ceremonies in obedience to the directions prescribed by the Shastras and thereby restore their former prestige and reinstall their original status as Kshatriyas. While one could argue that Karan was not focused on annihilation of caste, but reviving an original Varna status, one needs to put his efforts in context. For people like him, it was a matter of self-respect of the community, and to reawaken self-confidence, such historical scriptural excavation was required. The need to do so arose from the experience of being maltreated by the Brahmin and upper caste officers in the census department who used every opportunity to project Poundros derogatorily. Rajendra Sarkar, fourth thinker, 1903 to 1979, a Poundro from Khulna, was in radical opposition to the kind of self-respect movement launched by Karan and others. When in the early 20th century, the British government opened the provision for reservation of jobs for a list of backward communities to be eventually recognized as scheduled caste and included the Poundros in it, many Poundro proponents of self-respect violently protested the move. However, it was Rajendranath Sarkar and his Poundro associates from Khulna who fought for the inclusion of the Poundros in the scheduled caste list. What makes Rajendranath a radical thinker is his pragmatism to reflect on the present condition of the Poundros rather than dwelling on a once upon a time glorious identity from the past. While he was personally indebted to Karan and Raicharan Sardar, a towering Poundro reformer, he did not let his personal weakness get into the way of a movement that was meant for the advancement of the collective. He was strongly convinced of the need to accept the opportunity of governmental protection for the Poundros because without this, they would never be able to come at par with the caste Hindus. He believed that the governmental provisions would help them get electoral representation, educational advantages, and job opportunities. Unlike others, for him, the fight for recognition of the Kshatriya background of the Poundros was not in conflict with their inclusion in the list of protected castes. The advancement of the Poundros today, whatever be the scale, owes much to the fight for the reservation led by Rajendranath. Such radical move made by Rajendranath was deeply rooted, one could argue, in the dire poverty and caste-based discrimination faced by him and many others like him. His educational pursuit was repeatedly affected due to his inability to pay for school and college fees. He experienced caste-based discrimination and was maltreated as an untouchable on multiple occasions. In his autobiography, Jibon Kotha, he documents many such instances described as Jatir Nami Bodjati, humiliating the lower castes in the name of caste purity. For Rajendranath, in the face of being maltreated as untouchables, it was not enough to make a counterclaim that Poundros were not untouchables or outcasts because historically they had been the Kshatriyas. Such a claim for recognition of their glorious past would not bring an end to discrimination. What was required was to empower the Poundros with financial capital and cultural capital, both of which were guaranteed by the protective measures of the British Raj, and thereby overcome their was a socio-historical reality as opposed to myth history. Rajendranath's singular contribution to Dalit resistance in Bengal was to ensure that the Poundros benefited from the policies regarding the redistribution of wealth. For him, such redistribution was as important as the struggle for cultural recognition. Echoing critic Radha Sarkar, who argues that the question of material redistribution must be combined with that of cultural recognition, one could say that it is Rajendranath who completed the Poundro resistance and renaissance initiated by Mahendranath Karan, Raicharan Sardar, and others. I now move to the last thinker, Mahendranath Molde, wrongly described as a Rajbongshi by Swaraj Bosu, who was arguably the sharpest Malo thinker of colonial Bengal. In his masterpiece, Ditiyo Borno Kshatriyo Jhal Mal Tattva in Bangla, 1914, he theorized the history and identity of the Malo community, while doing so, offered an extremely insightful critique of the Hindu scriptures by demonstrating their inconsistencies and interpolations. His conclusion is that Malos were neither Shudros nor born of mixed castes, but had historically been Brakta Kshatriyas. For him, Brakta Kshatriyas were simply those Kshatriyas who could not, for whatever reason, undergo Upanayana or the sacred thread ceremony at the right age. Drawing on the 15th Kanda of Atharva Veda, he argues that the Braktas used to be worshipped by the Dijos and were considered harbinger of divine grace. For him, being a Brakta Kshatriya was not a matter of shame or disrespect, but a matter of pride. Furthermore, the explanation provided by Molde about Malos being Kshatriyas is very innovative. If Malos were Kshatriyas, then how come their current profession is fishing? One of his arguments is that fishing involves catching or killing the fish with weapons. Weapons were for use by the Kshatriyas. Hence, fishing suits as a Kshatriya profession. It is their Swadharma. Therefore, for him, there is no contradiction in being a Malo fisher and being a Kshatriya at the same time. One is struck by how Molde interpretation of Brakta Kshatriya is opposed to that of Mahendranath Karan, the Poundro thinker already discussed, who also wrote on this subject. For the former, the term Brakta or fallen is not an attribute of disrespect, while for the latter, the history of being Brakta for Molde is not a history of shame. For Karan, it is. I argue that such internal debates and disagreements surrounding naming in the process of identity formation make the Dalit intellectual tradition critical and independent of the Brahmanical discourse, which could not, unlike what Shekhar Bandyopadhyay and others think, subsume the imagination of the Dalits in colonial times. Conclusion, multiple Bengali Dalit communities organized and mobilized themselves, convened scores of conferences and meetings, opened independent journals, magazines, and newspapers, and published countless texts from the 1870s to 1940s in colonial Bengal. Thanks to colonial modernity, capitalism, use of the printing press, and the intervention of the British in social matters, Dalit communities like Poundro, Namashudro, Malo, Rajbongshi, and others, many others, plunged into self-respect movements. From closely analyzing and criticizing the scriptures to launching independent, socially transformative religious movements, and then debating and eventually accepting the colonizers' prohibitions for protective measures, including redistribution of wealth and proportional representation, the colonial period was a series of politically, socially, and culturally throbbing moments for the Dalits. The reformation measures undertaken by the Dalit groups were nothing short of revolutionary, and the theoretical debates produced by them were unprecedented. Thus, the colonial Bengal witnessed a Dalit or caste subaltern or rural renaissance come resistance that the official history of Bengal, dominated by Marxist, Brahminical, and nationalist historians, has failed to adequately take a note of. The history of Bengal Renaissance, which reserved no place for the lower castes, outcasts, Dalits, women, and minorities, is still celebrated from school textbooks to university discourses in Bengal as the greatest moment of the Indian freedom movement. But whose Renaissance was Bengal Renaissance? Whose interest did it serve? From 1858 to 1900, not a single Dalit student was admitted to the University of Calcutta. The Brahmin teachers of Sanskrit College resigned en masse when Kayastha students took admissions there. Vidyasagar resigned from a mainstream theatre committee of Kolkata when Girish Ghosh proposed that women actors from lower caste and prostitute quarters will be recruited as actors. From Vidyasagar to Vivekananda, nobody launched any effective resistance against the evils of casteism. Almost the entire landscape of Bengal Renaissance was populated by Brahmin men serving the interests of Brahmin patriarchy. Bengal Renaissance, therefore, was predominantly a Brahminical Renaissance of, by, and for Brahmin men. An overemphasis on its glory, I argue, would be tantamount to committing epistemic violence to the Dalit Renaissance and resistance that had taken place at the same time around the same place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for an excellent presentation. We move on to Vignesh and Vishal. And you have 15 minutes and we inform you when time is up.
Thank you very much, Professor. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everybody. So Vishal and I mean, the paper that we are going to present would actually be a southern extension of Mahitosh's paper. Thank you very much, Mahitosh, for the brilliant paper. Well, our what we tried in this paper is try to sort of broaden the lens with which we look at anti-caste activists. For instance, Ambedkar's view on political economy, because he's the person behind, Baba Sahib is the person behind the RBI's formation in the country, and he's an economist as well. So that, in a certain sense, his ideas about political economy is studied a little lesser or discussed a little lesser. So our understanding is, to try our understanding of Periyar, for instance, is to sort of is to see him a little more broader than the anti-caste activist, the women empowerment, or the iconoclast that he's known as. So, I mean, Periyar is largely associated with anti-caste activism, which he did all his life. But then our paper tries to argue how his understanding of caste, or how his theory, how Periyarism, in a certain sense, if that could be formed after his death, after so many years of his death, had actually informed the Dravidian parties that had followed him, or the Dravidian movement, in their economic and empowerment project. So, in a certain sense, Periyar's project of societal empowerment revolved around recognition, redistribution, representation. In fact, Karthik also told us how you could not, for a person like Periyar, you could not make him, the philosopher, a conventional philosopher, as one could make out from the many that we have. So, in hindsight, if we were to look at Periyar's, body of work, or his his activism, I mean, we could sort of see, we could sort of try and attribute Nancy Fraser's, triad of recognition, redistribution, representation. And Periyar is also someone who's engaged with communism in detail. His engagement with communism, the Communist Manifesto, he'd actually translated it and also written a foreword, which is very important. And he was genuinely impressed by the Communist Soviet. But where Periyar, but at the same time, Periyar also shared skepticism along with Ambedkar, of Indian communists, especially owing to their caste lineage. So for him, the project of empowerment needed social equality first, and then, or social justice first, before economic justice could be taken up. In this aspect, what Periyar actually spoke of was for a truly classless society, or for some kind of a class activism or a class revolution to come into place, there needed to be societal equality. And therefore, like Ambedkar, Periyar also was very skeptical of Tamil communists, for instance. And when given a choice between supporting the CPI and the Congress Party, and in the wake of the DMK trying to split away from the DK, Periyar stood behind K. Kamaraj, who was a subaltern leader who stood for, again, similar redistributive thought, redistributive ideas, rather than going with the communists. And on that note, the Periyar at the same time also did not engage himself with or engage with the Kshatriya status, or the slippage from the Kshatriya status of the Shudras. What he did essentially was to forge a horizontal solidarity. I mean, and he's not the first person. We do see him as an aggregator in chief and an important addition in this history, starting from Ayodhya who was one of the first people who framed the word Dravidian, but that was taken forward. So essentially, Dravidian and Tamil as a hyphenated identity, came to be as the supralocal identity that could be imposed on multiple caste groups. And when that was done, Periyar's engagement with a lot of caste elites and lower caste activists, or even lower caste associations. He was a guy who'd actually he was a reformer who'd spoken across caste associations. And then his one-point agenda was to actually tell people that there are neither anybody above someone nor there are anybody below someone. So that kind of a horizontal solidarity, when that was forged in the 20s and the 30s, was very important to sort of engage with the backward caste people, to sort of try and tone down their demands for the Kshatriya status. So he was against it, and he was against any sort of an antiquity, as long until and unless they actually had some kind of a moral ethos that was okay. But otherwise, he was always willing to sort of shun the past and then move forward. His was a forward-looking agenda. But at the same time, for that kind of an identity to sort of hold on, one needed an element of antiquity and what Erik Hobson calls as the invented tradition. So as Bernard Bate sort of crystallized that for the Dravidian movement, one of his lieutenants, Annadurai, actually relied on the Sangam era and actually recast Sangam era as this caste-free society that could be emulated. For the Dravidian Tamil society of that point in time to move forward. So, I mean, largely what was then done is, while Baba Saheb was a meticulous, structuralist, Periyar was an unapologetic pragmatist that engaged with multiple communities simultaneously but differently. So, for instance, while the 20s and 30s were this, the 40s and 50s were marked by Periyar actually reaching out to a lot, what he called Adi Dravidas or the Dalits, to actively try and talk to them about how they should be a lot more assertive. And he always sort of stayed not as their voice, but as their comrade, as he would call himself, in their fight. And he would always ask them to be very shrewd with their demands, or very unapologetic about their demands, and to actually even question the DMK or even charge the DMK with accusations if the DMK were to fail. And with this kind of an assertion or an assertive sensibility that he tried to inculcate among people, and the idea of asking questions, when the fact that this was tried to sort of inculcate, this was inculcated across sections, we do see in Vivek Srinivasan's work, for instance, the practice or the culture of questioning across the society. And the idea of speaking truth to power or questioning always resulted in people being sort of elevated, but and not looked down upon. And on that note, where we stop is, or where I stop now is, this kind of a theory that Periyar sort of, looked at or conceived was then taken forward by his lieutenants, Annadurai, C.N. Annadurai, or oftenly known as Anna, or Karunanidhi, M. Karunanidhi, who's often known as Kalaignar, who then took to the redistributive agenda and the representational agenda. Today, for instance, Tamil Nadu has the most socially diverse legislature. So that, I mean, I'd like sort of my co-author Vishal to take forward.
Thanks, Vignesh. To add on to what Vignesh was saying and to kind of substantiate all the claims we are making in this paper, I just wanted to touch upon very briefly on 2 to 3 large aspects of what the successive Dravidian governments from the 70s have achieved in Tamil Nadu through their agendas of affirmative action, legislation, and administrative reform. So, to begin with, I think MSS Pandian noted that, the politics of the DMK was built around 2 major ideological planks. One was caste-based social justice and the other was Tamil identity. And the politics of caste-based social justice that the Dravidian governments then took forth, it took the form of a critique of caste hierarchy and Brahmanism, which was coupled with continuous improvisations in reservations of government jobs and seats in educational institutions for lower caste. So, one important aspect of that was the fact that, like, today in educational institutions, there's almost 69% reservation. And, Ajanta Subramaniam, in her book, Caste of Merit, she notes that, even as the writers of the Indian Constitution generally agreed that graded and ascriptive inequality needed redressal, they often differed on the methods of redressal. And one major aspect of what the Tamil Nadu government overall has done was that they did not necessarily was around rather appropriating constitutional language of social differentiation and whether caste should be accorded legal recognition, at least is what the debate on the constitution was. And one thing that the Tamil Nadu government has done is it's strayed away, has rather disregarded the norm of formal equality, which kind of takes on from a Periyarist practice where formal equality didn't seem to hold as much importance as redressal of historic social injustices. And this can be seen right from 1971, where the reservation for the backward classes was increased from 25 to 31%. And then reservation for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe was increased from 16 to 18%. And then later, responding to the one-year agitations in 1989, a separate 20% reservation was provided within the OBC quota. It's seen further evidence further with how the Karnataka government at that time firmly backed the Mandal Commission reports and even fought it in the Supreme Court. I just wanted to quickly move on to the use of legislation and administrative reforms as a tool for social justice by the Dravidian governments. It's beyond the scope of this discussion and I suppose this paper to kind of analyze every single legislation or administrative reform, but I wanted to highlight a few which I think had like particular effects on a Periyarist praxis. So first one, like in 1969, the Tamil Nadu Agriculture Labor Fair Wages Act was enforced it was enacted to enforce fair payment of wages to agricultural laborers and penalize landowners who exploited laborers. Similarly, another act was the Tamil Nadu Land Reforms Reduction of Ceiling Act, where a law was brought to reduce disparities in land holdings by reducing the land ceiling limit from 30 acres to 15 acres. All of this was kind of, as what Ryerson says, this kind of brought in a notion of scientific socialism and a non-theistic interpretation of Tamil literary texts. Like these governments brought in this identity of rather reinforced this Tamil identity and also brought in these notions of scientific socialism. Another important reform immediately brought in was, which a lot of people have heralded as revolutionary, was in Karnataka in 1975 promulgated an ordinance that abolished the system of hereditary village headmen and replaced them with village officers who were recruited by the TNPSC, the Tamil Nadu State Public Service Commission. So these reforms had implications from an economic and a social front. A hereditary village headman system allowed for concentration of resources to a few families, which further propagated control of power and a lot of social capital as well. Overall, the Dravidian model as such was not just to create institutions for social justice and welfare, but also for rapid industrialization and economic growth. This can, seen by Karunanidhi's creation of SIPCOT, the State Industries Promotion Corporation of Tamil Nadu, 1971, which proved very useful when the Indian economy opened up in 1991. It created a lot of land banks, which could then immediately be utilized. And this we can see much evidence today with the manufacturing and the information technology boom over here. Finally, to conclude, I think another very interesting aspect of the social justice coupled with economic justice reform taking on a Periyarist practice was Karunanidhi's idea of creating a Samatvapuram, which in English translates to equality village, where the idea was to create villages of 100 houses each, where 40 houses would be occupied by Dalits, 25 by backward caste, 25 by most backward class, and 10 for other communities. And each village was to have one common community hall and one common burial ground. By 2001, over 145 Samatwapurams have been created in different parts of Tamil Nadu, with all of them still being active today. I think all of this provides while there are many more reforms and legislations, I think all of this provides a fairly substantial body of evidence to show that these notions of social justice before economic justice and social justice through economic justice have been kind of the idea of the day for these Dravidian governments. And this could have been conflated in some ways with communism, or this, and as my co-author Vignesh said, Periyar was always rather skeptical of communists, not because of the agenda of communism, but rather the fundamental reason we suppose lay in the Brahmin dominance within the Tamil communist leadership, and what the Dravida Karagam at that point of time would have us believed to be its logical consequence, which would be Tamil communist subservience to North Indian domination. So I think with that, I'll conclude and be happy to answer any questions necessary.
Thank you very much indeed, Vishal and Vignesh, for a very informative paper. We give floor to Prem Ram, MR, and please, Prem Ram, the floor is yours.
Thanks, in my paper, I am titled Expose.
It's slightly difficult to hear you properly. Please carry on.
I hope now it's audible.
Please just try, and we can try to hear you.
Yeah. Okay. See, my paper title is
we hear you very well now, so please carry on.
This goes on communication between us and Periyar, looking for the possibilities of transversing caste relation. So, how do we think beyond caste? So, in a way, in this paper, I'm attempt how the idea of Adi Dravida as a casteless collective being forced and also be a reason and precursor for the Dravidian discourse in Tamilnadu, and what are the convergence and as well as divergence aspects of it in terms of its ideological understanding, in a way, certain aspects of convergence and divergence. Uh, uh, First, I'll just look at the relationship between Periyars and Brahmins as a kind of antagonistic relationship. And this antagonism is not just uh, the invention of the recent past, in historical injustice done to the Periyar community. And it's also analyzing how Periyar community has been degraded into the effect of Vedic sexual impositions and so on. And also, in a way, try to reconstruct and imagine the past, in this past of the low caste and especially Periyar community of race. In a way, try to look at a Buddhist imagination for Adi Dravida community. And also, he has different kind of strategy to work with the political state of colonial regime, and also acting in terms of running a publication house also plays a common from 1914. And also he draws kind of pool of resources from different kind of groups. In the idea of society, especially when you deep on the question of caste and religion, in a way the environment cannot be passed through the foregrounding mechanisms of caste and also we look at the question of education as a morality, the moral question. So you foreground the question of moral ethics as a form of education, and also constantly posing the question of rights. What are the rights existing for the subaltern community? And this idea of politics is also something significant in terms of expressing the idea of spirituality. Spirituality to look at the question of politics, not only and also as a form of governance. So, this having kind of different looking at politics as a form of spirituality and also politics as a form of geographic, spatial aspects of governance. He's just trying to reconstruct the classical Tamil text, Mullai, Maru, Legal, Pali, all these five places trying to talk about how these places were governed earlier the traditional past. And he's quite critical about the Indian National Congress, and we have a kind of very soft aspects to Christianity that we accept that Christianity and Muslim institutions have done substantial changes to the Dalit communities of Dalit towns. And after this remote year 1940, the movement which was spread across, especially across the South Asian society among the migrant labor community. After this, Vignesh slowly started using this currency and spread due to the luck, strong leadership and so on. However, there are quite significant writers such as G. Appadurayar and A.P. Periyasamy and Anumanta Upasakar. So all these writers consistently write on this journal from them. And later these writers also contributed to the magazine called Dravidian, which was established by the Justice Party in the year 1970. And if you could see kind of transactions between the ideas of Anti-Caste and how it has been established in the journal of Justice Party, it's quite one could see the political trajectories of these ideas, how Dravida and Dravidian has taken shape in the early 20th century of Tamil. And now we can see, just I'm trying to work with the differences with the Periyar idea of Dravidian, the idea of Dravidian or question of caste or question of nationality. Periyar tried to try to debunk the entire ritualistic aspects of social norms, values, and so on. And also working with the idea of negotiating with the colonial regime of the state and so on. Whereas, but these ideas of rationality, especially, sometimes tend to take the shape of nihilism. Nihilism, one could say, is my argument. So nihilism is something which is nothing. So whereas one could juxtapose with the ideas understanding is something with a substantial level of rationality. I stop it here.
Yeah, very. Thank you so much, Premram. We had some technical issues, but still we were able to hear you. And this is one of the beauties with this conference, that we could sit in different locations, and we could talk about these organic thinkers across time zones, regions, and to be part of the conversation. So I think we have obviously a lot to learn from all of these papers. So thank you all participants for the papers. I will just like to respond in a few minutes before we open for questions. I think in the sense that we could consider this, I mean, just your presentations as an act of translating knowledge across regions and global time zones. And we have here, we have like two papers from South India and Tamilnadu in particular, and we have a third paper from West Bengal, East India, and where the latter has been referring to Bengal has been referred in the literature as the most casteist state, despite the absence of this question, or precisely because of its repressed nature in that particular state. So that's one statement in the literature. But it's great to learn more about these papers and the work that you have in progress along these lines. So this session is about anti-caste thinkers, and the papers tend to confirm the different possibilities and the histories that we have presented on this topic. But I would like to ask a question to the panelists. And the question is, what is an anti-caste thinker? Should we have one definition, or just change depending on the context and person about whom we are talking about? But I think what all of these papers and your presentations tend to show is that And the anti-caste thinkers, they don't come out of the blue. People have been brought up and educated in the movement by mentors and even parents, as we heard in the first paper. Although Ambedkar's volumes are blue, he was also not coming out like that. He was brought up in the movement. So in any case, I think the discussion about anti-caste thinkers is an important topic. And we have this possibility to share this. But it's also a fascinating, it's not only this conference that is fascinating, but it's also an important moment historically, because the scientific community across the globe has been exposed to many critical questions and forms of critique, especially for being unable to give proper voice to members of the historical excluded communities. And so we have globally movements going under names like decolonization, critical caste studies, and critical race studies. But I think the study of organic thinkers, and in this case, anti-caste thinkers, offer at least two valuable insights. First, they acquire insights that are valuable for a wider pursuit of truth about caste as a social problem. And these insights are useful for the scientific community, academics, and we should be reminded of the American context here too. Du Bois was as you know, black sociologist who developed a perceptive sociology to explain racial inequalities based on and how that was based on socially constructed form of oppression. But his sociology was at the time was excluded, as Alden Morris, this American sociologist, has been explaining. He was a scholar denied. And I think so. If the first task is about the pursuit of truth, this also gives us a second advantage, which is that they could develop insights into what freedom and the struggle for freedom from domination and what this is about. So if I could, so what I could highlight in these papers, we have different papers and different aims in these papers, but they offer some useful comparative promises. We have we have anti-caste thinkers across India. As I understand it, my knowledge is limited, but and my interpretation could be contested. But as I understand it, Tamilnadu is a state where caste has been quite visible, either in terms of caste-based violence or anti-caste critiques. West Bengal offers a different history with a very strong emphasis on class and a less visible caste topic. We could come back to that, whether this is true or whether you accept it. But and I don't know West Bengal myself to that extent, but I was absolutely fascinated by Mahitosh Mandal's paper. And what I think is striking, from my point of view, is the question of class, which is, perhaps part of the problem. And it's also discussed in the paper on the Dravidian movement. And I'm keen to mention here, if I may, the Telugu-speaking states like Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, where we have where the Dalit movement, Dalit movements have had a strong connection to the Maoist movement. And this includes a very distinguished man who is also present in this audience, possibly today. He was there yesterday, Kanchalaya, who explains in an early essay chapter about how the Telugu-speaking areas offer a caste class theory that one cannot find elsewhere. So this is Kanchalai's early statement. But I think here we have methodological denial of engaging with caste, which is, as far as the paper goes, inbuilt in the academic community. the paper was discussed, had the critique of the subaltern school, but this school has been redefining the subaltern as a question of the proletariat, devoid of any difference, and that's often how it's used today as well. But I would encourage you also to consider the situation as a question of trained incapacity, which is a term used in conventional social and organizational theory. We could study academic community across the world as shaped by certain professions and schools, and the implication often is that these have some blind spots. And so trained incapacity is about learning blind spots. In this case, caste. And this reflects a wider question. What is so special with Bengal, and what could we possibly learn from Periyar in that context? And I think, like you all engage with some data and some historical sources, I think the attempt by Mahitosh in his paper to take the original sources seriously and translate these histories to a larger audience. Not only here, but perhaps even for Bengalis. It might be a new piece of information, and you could enlighten us on that afterwards. But I think the archives of the oppressed would be, is what we are talking about. That these we don't have, for many reasons, we haven't studied them too well. And then keeping on with this Bengal paper, I think we have some interesting anti-caste thinkers. In a sense, I wonder if they're actually, how dismissive they are of religious texts, and we have like a struggle for practical solutions while being engaged in politics of naming. But at the same time, I think we have, as I understand it, we have Thakur as a non-religious and egalitarian thinker. Another one who, Karan, who seems to refer to the Varna schemes and how one was degenerated into Shudras while being Kshatriyas. And this is quite similar actually to Srinivas's sociology. Where there is a movement between, from Shudra to Kshatriyas or vice versa, and so to what extent, in the Bengal context, do they seek casteless name in the same manner as Ayotidas? That's a question, and Ayotidas has been Prem Ram's focus, and which and Prem Ram has been comparing him to Periyar. And my understanding of these thinkers, and you are the experts, and we have many experts in the audience, because many of us have been using the secondary sources, is that Ayotidas and Periyar have a very different style of theorizing. So what is the difference between them, and how do they compare? And then another question related to this, because in terms of time, we're starting out, people don't come out of the blue, and we could ask whether Periyar's work would be possible without TAS. So to what extent has he developed that? If you could specify, that would be great. As I understand it, Periyar, and we heard about this earlier today, is a nearly anarchic thinker, and with many polemical statements, and thus here is more scholarly, with his focus on the publication of Tamilnadu. So apart from this different style of theorizing, I wonder if you could elaborate on their understanding of ideology, and particularly the question, what is it that produces caste? Is caste embodied in social life, or does it originate in religious texts? And to what extent, I mean, is gender part of this? We've been talking about caste and class, gender, where does it come in the question of regarding caste? So we have two substantial thinkers in Tas and Periyar, and you in Premram and also Vishal Vignesh bring in the question of the state, and to what extent is the state relevant to describe their thinking? I think, as you rightly point out, we have like the state provides rights and entitlements, and it's changing. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more what characterizes their thinking, and because I mean, in the context of the state, would it be right and entitlements? Would you say that their actual interest is in dignity and egalitarianism? I mean, would we be able to understand them better if we don't involve the categories of the state, for instance? So, what does the category of the state do to their thinking? And as we heard, Vignesh, Karthik, and Vishal Vasanthakumar in their paper addressed, brought up this on a full scale, and I wonder, and this also brings us back to the question of caste and the class and material resources, which in their paper is a question of policies, schemes, entitlements, and the creation of life chances. So rather than a question of religion and ideology, Vignesh and Vishal discuss Periyar's interest in redistribution as part of his social agenda. And I'm not that familiar with his work to say something informed about him on these questions. But your focus on redistribution somehow emphasized this material dimension. And you refer to a number of acts and schemes created largely by you refer to Karunandi as the politician. And now my question to you would be, to what extent would you see Karunandi as an independent ideologist, a follower of Periyar's rationalism, or just a strategic politician? And here, one of the important questions would be, how is it placed in relation to all of the cases of caste-based violence, and what does it tell us about him as an actor in this anti-caste project? But I think what your paper enlightened us about is the constant dialogue with the communist movement, which is for me a new piece of information to this extent. Gender is not part of that conversation, it seems. But would you say that the communist movement has made any impact on the Dravidian movement, and how have they responded? Have they just pushed it away? So two final points before I should wind up. First, I think I would like to go back to the comparative perspective. So Tamilnadu is a successful state when compared to others. It's a long history of schemes, but we also have a long history of schemes in states like Punjab, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, and Karnataka. And would it be possible to say that the policies have been inspired from other sources than Periyar? And what is unique about the Dravidian movement when it comes to developing these schemes? And what does and then a question is here, what does legal and empowerment and schemes do to the question of caste? Does it address caste to that scale? But I think that's, and the second point is that we've been learning about caste and class, but what about gender? How does it fit into these papers? And to what extent, and we heard that from the previous panel, it was a big, interesting dialogue about the significance of this category, gender. But to what extent is that important for the contribution of these anti-caste thinkers? So I will try to conclude by saying that one of the advantages with the comparative approach, which is my proposition, is that we could work on these blind spots, and perhaps bringing these two regions into comparison, or the comparative perspective into account, could be. I wonder if we could do something with whether this would be useful for your papers, and how, and then going back to the first paper, how could Periyar be relevant, if at all, in making sense of the situation in Bengal? Because I think so this is one question I have, but we have a number of very exciting questions for the Q&A, but I will give the possibility for the panelists to respond. And I ask all the panelists to switch on their cameras so that we can see you. You're the star of the show. So please go ahead. Yeah. If you have something you would like to say.
Mahitosh, you want to go first?
I mean, you can speak first. Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, please go ahead. I have some notes that I've made, so please go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, sincere thanks to Professor Dr. Berg for closely reading the papers. I could feel it the way you responded to the papers. Thank you very much. Your response means a lot for further improvement. And I think that the points that you have made are absolutely relevant for my paper, at least, for sure. For example, the last point you made about the relevance of Periyar in the context of the writers I have talked about. Certainly, when I was writing, and I repeatedly came across this phrase in Bangla, Attomorjada Lodai. Attomorjada Lodai literally would translate to struggle for self-respect. Now, this is something that the very manifesto of Periyar. I have read very little of Periyar, but the little I have read, for example, his text on self-respect movement, and I could find echoes of it. Although these people didn't know each other, but somewhere, as it were, in the collective unconscious of the caste subaltern, there was this demand for self-respect, struggle for self-respect. So even though I haven't really connected or tried to read Periyar in conjunction with them and vice versa, I think it is absolutely possible and necessary. So I would definitely look into and explore further works of Periyar to actually connect. But for example, the attitude to freedom struggle and the attitude to the struggle of the oppressed in the thinkers I have discussed and in Periyar seem to be somewhat similar. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you, but one question that we have to you while we have you here on the line. There's a question to you about can a Dalit historiography be undertaken by with the same commitment by non-Dalits, or are there epistemic hurdles such an undertaking? What is the problem? Could non-Dalits do this work that you point out?
Okay, that's a sensitive question to begin with, but I think I don't know, the debate is there. I think I'm not the person to resolve it, but I think one needs to problematize the possibilities and limitations. So that much I can say. Whoever is engaging with the writing of history needs to reflect on the possibilities and limitations. That much I can say. Yeah. Yeah. So
interesting. It's a big question.
Yeah.
But perhaps we should give the opportunity to Vignesh and we will surely come back. Vignesh, you had some points.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, with respect to Ayodhidasar and Periyar, I mean, I'd like to rely just on one of the most recent suo motu statements given out by the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, who had actually ordered for the construction of a memorial for Ayodhidas. And he says that, I mean, in fact, Ayodhidas actually holds the position now officially by the state, which is to have actually been the pioneer of, in conceiving the words Dravidian and Tamil. And these two words, the hyphenated identity that we look at, the Dravidian and Tamilan, are the two words that, I mean, and Ayodhidasar has been, recognized or seen rightfully as the pioneer. And in fact, fun fact is, it was his grandfather, Ayodhidas's grandfather, Mr. Kandappan, who had given Mr. Ellis the copy of Tirukkural to be translated, and then now whatever we have of Tirukkural. So in that sense, and Periyar himself sort of saw Ayodhidasar as his pioneer. So, I mean, briefly, I had mentioned in a line saying Periyar was the aggregator in chief of people who had been before him. So there was an organization called Madras Secular Society that was practically drawing from the Enlightenment revolution and then Enlightenment theory, and then going after texts here. And there was Father Robert Caldwell, and at the same time there was Ayodhidasar, all of them simultaneously working. And then that kind of an identity, so the politicization of that kind of an identity was taken up by Periyar. It was actually, in a certain sense, Periyar was the democratizer in chief. So he went, street after street, house after house. At some places he was welcomed with garlands, at some places he was welcomed with slippers, but he still kept talking. And in that sense, and what is Periyar's addition is the sense of, the idea of being unapologetic in his counter. So every time he saw any sort of a discrimination, be it gender, caste, etc., he actually went after them. And then in a certain sense, if I were to sort of link it, and the best part is he also had his lieutenants to take this in with and normalize it within the vocabulary of state, or institutionalize it in the vocabulary of state. So where does the idea gender, where does the element of gender lie here? Periyar did not write a lot. He spoke a lot, but he wrote little. I mean, lesser than how much he spoke. But of whatever he's written a book, a very powerful book called Penye Nadimayanal, Why Were Women Enslaved? There's a translation available, and it is probably, and he roots the evils of caste in gender. So for him, so while the communists might stop with class, and then social anti-caste activists might stop at caste, Periyar believed that true anti-casteism is only when you break the shackles of gender, or gender subjugation. So for him, gender meant that. And the other question now is Karunanidhi, and how he differed from Periyar is, with respect to the cultural leaning. So for Periyar, it was always a forward-looking project, but Karunanidhi did rely on the past a little bit for the antiquity element. So for the Dravidian identity, or as a political identity, to stand up or to counter the Sanskritized offering. And in fact, when asked by Pravda, Karunanidhi said what his goals were. When Pravda asked what the goals were of the DMK were, he said social justice in society, rationalism in culture, and socialism in economy, and democracy in politics. So this kind of an institutionalization, a political within the vocabulary of state was what Karunanidhi did. And vis-a-vis caste-based violence, yes, Karunanidhi was in power, during the notorious, and even another for that matter, during notorious anti-caste, caste violences, not anti-caste, sorry, caste violences. But then the standpoints that they had taken over and again was always in a very, in an incremental manner. to the extent that today we see a change in the nature of violence that's inflicted upon Dalits. So for instance, in the 80s and the 90s, or even before that, violence was a function of dominance, ritual dominance, and arrogance. But in the late 2000 and early 2000s and 2010, 12, etc., the violence that we see now is a function essentially of a kind of insecurity because of the economic and educational mobility of Dalits. We see Dalit houses ransacked, the markers of mobility like degree certificates being torn, rather than an everyday normalized hate violence. And it is essentially an outcome of a pent-up anger rather than everyday violence of sorts. But this does not mean that we have reached there yet. No, not at all. We do have, and at the same time, we also have a Dalit caste group which hates being called Dalit. I mean, this is the Devendra in South Tamil Nadu, who are very clear, very particular about not being called Dalits because of their relative mobility that they perceive to have achieved. So we do see a set of, so Tamil Nadu's model has actually opened up its own complications that the parties are trying to sort of, but what all of these are very particular about, all of these communities are particular about is the idea of mainstreaming their identities or their grievances as meticulously argued by Professor Amit Ahuja, where he says the Dalits in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu have mainstreamed their grievances compared to UP and Bihar. Therefore, you have stronger Dalit parties in UP and Bihar, but you have stronger Dalit movements in Tamil Nadu and Maharashtra. And Tol Tirumavalam, one of the strong tallest the leaders of the Dalit Panthers movement, has actually testified to this, and he has emerged to become the leader of Tamil Nadu, and he was at the forefront of leading the anti-CAA and RC protest, which was essentially a larger question. Sorry.
Very good. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, some of your points are actually corresponding also with my book, but we do have a number of questions to you and Vishal, but and we could have one of them. What is the critique? I mean, if you could explain that for the audience of that the communists have of Periyar.
So I was just going to take up that question myself. So I just wanted to quote from a particular meeting that happened within the CPM back, I think, in the 50s, if I'm not wrong. And this meeting was quoted in a journal called the Radical Review, where it's an anonymous author, and the author has argued that Periyar should have stressed class and not caste. And I quote, he failed to see the connection between religion and a class society. In the tradition of Western rationalists, he pitted his idea of the rationalist path against the idea of God, both of them abstractions. Casteism survives because it's the handmaiden of class rule. Along with God and religion, caste is another powerful tool to divide the masses and divert their attention from economic facts of life. Periyar failed to realize that the road to a casteless society is the same as the road to a classless society. I think that sort of critique sums up largely the communist notion of bringing in material equality, giving material equality and class relations, keeping it at a much higher pedestal than class relations. But I think for Periyar and for successive Dravidian governments, they've always kind of looked more into the themes of memories, identity, myths, superstitions, and also on economic justice. The communist government, the communist movements in Tamil Nadu have always stressed on a class relation, but I think within the Dravidian movement, the notion has always been to place caste inequalities first and focus on caste inequalities as a propagator of class inequalities. And as Professor Berg said, I think it's a very valid notion to look at it from a comparative perspective, and it certainly merits more. I don't think there is any true answer to this question, but to answer the specific question by Partha Muthukarpan, I think this is what what I just said articulates quite and condenses what the communist critique of Periyar was.
Interesting. If sorry for interrupting you, but as you are on that point, Could you say, one of the questions is, could you say a little bit more about what is the difference between a social transformation and social justice from this movement's perspective?
I think it's a very broad question, and it's a little difficult to answer, but I'm just going to take a very uninformed crack at it, if I may. I think
I could, I could elaborate what I think is relevant on that question. I mean, if we consider a social transformation as an empirical process, social justice could be associated with specific values. So, what would the Dravidian movement be engaged? Strengthen a social transformation, or do they struggle for social justice?
If I may quickly sort of weigh in on that, I'm sorry, Vishal, but quickly weigh in on that. I think social transformation takes away the historical wrongdoings part of, social transformation. So essentially, social transformation or social justice would be a prelude to social transformation, in a certain sense, to sort of locate the why within, where people stand. For instance, if an X stands at 10 rupees in his pocket and a Y stands at $100 in his pocket, the idea is to sort of situate why X and Y are where they are, and then now take this forward.
Good. Yes, we should also come back to Prem, but while you're here, there was one question regarding your comparison of Ambedkar and Periyar, where you considered Periyar as a pragmatist and Ambedkar as a structuralist. I was not able to get that point, but how do you say that? How do you see this? The difference between Periyar and Ambedkar?
Ambedkar was very meticulous with what he's written. And he made sure that whatever he thought was very meticulously communicated and written. And for me, one line of Ambedkar that everybody should meditate on is, there are no castes. There is no caste. There are only castes. And the idea of graded inequality, the most simplest description or explanation of one of the most complicated systems of injustice in this society. And when only a person who understands or sees relations within a person's or an individual's engagement vis-a-vis the larger structures can come up with that. And that's one line which makes me argue, or which makes me look at Baba Saheb as the meticulous structuralist as he is. But Periyar just picks on that and then just goes ahead unapologetically, and wherever he sees, he becomes the hammer, and wherever he sees the nail, he hits on it. Ambedkar definitely had a social movement after it, but then that contribution of his, this simple line, or this very powerful line, in my understanding, is what sort of guides today's anti-caste, or which should guide the anti-caste movement.
Very good. I think we could have a separate panel just on this question. I think that's an interesting question. But I just wanted to go back to Premram's paper on TAS and Periyar. So and I wondered if you could, what's your what do you think is the main difference between TAS and Periyar as thinkers? What is it that Periyar takes from TAS? For us who are not experts on these thinkers. You have muted yourself,
specifically, the text of Avaya and Tirkural, it's been popularized by Periyar, and it's also topics of Dravidian movements and so on. So this is one aspect of it, and also in a way, the idea of not talking about glorified past, that is the kind of difference which I find. And whether this is something which it takes, which is relevant for the present. That he emphasized in the text of Periyarist published in 1927. And also there were a lot of women writers who contributed in the Periyarist journals, especially around the time of 1930s. Like what happened to the women writers? What is about their articulations on women questions in the Dravidian movement? So those questions really good work vis-a-vis the social movement as a Dravidian movement. So especially about the women who contributed to the journals.
Yeah, great. I mean, I take the privilege of being chair and asking you questions, and we have many interesting questions on the list. But I was wondering to ask you. I mean, I'm seated in a different part of the world, and ask those who are presenting papers in Tamilnadu, what at all could we learn from the history of anti-caste thinkers in Tamilnadu? Because I mean, in a sense, we often, and I think this we have some exceptions in the literature on Dalits, people who compare across regions. I mean, Gail Omved was one of those. But we rarely do it in the literature, and it's quite a challenging thing to do, to compare across caste. But the question would be, what could we learn? I mean, a man like me, in my context, why should we learn this history? And then I was wondering if we could also ask Mahitosh to explain. I mean, to give his proposition to what is it that, I mean, that you see as a possibility that Tamilnadu, I mean, the scholarship in Tamilnadu would be able to learn from the Bengal experience. I think, in a sense, we have. I mean, the problem with denial of caste is all over the place. I mean, we have that in the UK and so on. But what is it that one could learn from the Bengal history in Tamilnadu? That's my. So perhaps we could start with Mahitosh, and then if you afterwards could respond. We are running short on time, so
yeah. So very quickly, I mean, there are parallels, particularly in terms of how communist movement, communist parties have tried to suppress the caste question. I'd give a very quick example of during the Mandal Commission agitations in the 1990s, when Jyoti Basu was the chief minister of West Bengal, the communist chief minister, and he declared publicly that in Bengal, there are no backward castes. There are only proletariat classes. There are no BCs, there are only PCs. So that sums up how the Brahminical leadership, even in the guise of progressive communist movement, have tried to completely sideline the caste question. And also the entire scholarship, initially nationalist and then Marxist, and then even subaltern studies group, whom I have criticized in the larger paper, but I couldn't include due to the paucity of time, is that everybody, including Shumit Sarkar, who eventually left subaltern studies group, but who could never come out of that Marxist consciousness. So whenever he would talk about caste, he would look into the class dimension in caste. But for me, it is important to look at the caste dimension in class. So it's the other way around when it comes to Dalit historiography. And even Gayatri Chakrabarty Spivak, who wrote, of course, this famous essay everybody alludes to, Can the Subaltern Speak? And in response to that, one Malo historian from Bengal has written one article called, Yes, the Scheduled Castes Can Write. And he talks about some of the writings from colonial times, the particular time which Gayatri Chakrabarty Spivak focuses on to find out that there is silence in our archive, the subaltern is not there, and so on and so forth. But there is already an existing anti-caste Dalit archive, which none of these scholars have taken note of. Even as you pointed out, the term subaltern, initially for a long period of time, and a Gramsci scholar has literally criticized all the subaltern studies group scholars, subaltern was reduced to only one word, proletariat. Even though Gramsci himself in the larger prison notebooks used subaltern in various senses, the territorial subaltern, the religious subaltern, the gender subaltern, etc., etc. But because these scholars initially used a translation of the original Italian notebooks, which goes by the name Selections from Prison Notebooks, and they inevitably focused on only the class subaltern. So there are lots of problems, and I think it is both the political leadership in Bengal and the historiographical dimensions in Bengal, which have together, both intellectually and in the political praxis, have suppressed the caste question. And this is something I think conversation with Karthik long back, which is also which can be found in the Tamilnadu context. Where there is also,
I think we need to interrupt you. We have too much to discuss, but we have a limited time. And I had a question to Vishal and our friends in Tamilnadu. But I wonder if we are running short on time. So, but if you're able to respond very quickly, Vishal, then we can conclude in 1 minute.
I'll make this very short. So, particularly to the question of how do Dalits themselves look at the Dravidian model of social justice, there's been sustained critique by very eminent scholars like Professor Gorinj and Karthik Ram Manoharan on how the DMK, or rather the Dravidian movement, was not a non-Brahmin movement, but it was an anti-Brahmin movement. So, the OBCs have actually benefited a lot from it. And yes, there has been some amount of differential influence on press caste as such, but we Vignesh and I concur in the fact that this is still a continuum. If you look at it from again, like you said, from a comparative perspective, the Dalits in Tamil Nadu are faring substantially better than Dalits in other parts of the country, and both the economic and the social mobility of Dalits in Tamil Nadu, while there is a lot more to improve, there has been some improvement over the last 50 years of the Dravidian governments.
Thanks. I think we should conclude on that note. We have exceeded the time. I wish to thank each of the participants on this panel. And I wish you best of luck with these papers and the commitment to conclude these projects and to carry on. So I give
thank you, Dag. I must thank you for your efficient sharing and for a brilliant session with all the papers and all the presenters so deeply engaged. I'm sorry that Prem Ram, you had a little trouble with your audio, but since Dag had read your paper and we have your papers, so don't worry. In due course, the audience will also read what you have written, even though they couldn't hear very well what you did today. So it's been a marvelous day on the whole, and I'm kind of looking towards the last panel, and after which I have my concluding address. So please do wait for that before we finish, and have a good rest now. We return to meet at 3 o'clock BST. Bye-bye for now.